I'll talk a little bit about my latest book, which is that. I'll talk about my strange childhood in the theatre, the variety theatre, growing up with a father who was a comedian. I'll talk about other forms of writing. I know that you're interested in children's fiction, for example, and other members I know are dramatists as well as poets, and probably prose writers too. And then we'll leave as much time as we possibly can for questions and answers. I am very, very happy to try to address anything. The only thing I don't really do as a writer is I don't write adult novels. I've never really been drawn to that, but I write novels for children and young people. I've written a huge amount of animation over the years. I've been a writer for 50 years, which is a heck of a long time, it seems to me some days. I started as a poet back in my school days because it was a good way to meet girls, which I think is a very honest thing of me to say. I had no etchings they could come up and see when I was 16, but I could always say, I'll write you a poem. And boy, oh boy, that was like a box of chocolates, really. And I wrote more or less exclusively poetry for a dozen years, maybe. And I got published in magazines, and then I went on and I got a book out, which is that, Just a Matter of Time, a slim volume, as you can see. And I published that alongside Dylan Thomas's daughter, Aronwy. We were both published at the same time, and we gave readings together. And then I was overtaken by drama. I started to write plays. And for about 35 to 40 years, that's how I earned my living, that and lecturing at universities occasionally, and spending 7 years as a psychotherapist, which was a bit of a wonderful detour in my life, and stopped writing poetry until the dreaded COVID came along. And then all the theatres closed and all the television productions closed. So I had to go back to my first love. And believe it or not, in the last 3 years, and I'm embarrassed to say this, I've written 3,000 poems. If a student of, no, I thought you clapped out of pity, I think, probably. If a student of mine told me that, I would have shouted at them. That's a ludicrous number to write. And many of them, I have used photography and images of my own and public domain images. And I've married together the words and the images. And that's a lot of fun. I enjoy that tremendously. And the last 3 years has been almost exclusively writing poetry again. Once again, the circle has turned full. And I said, well, there you go. And I thought drama was in the past. But then, as so often happens in this crazy writing world, something came up. And at the moment, I am in the early stages of writing a new play. And that's just the way it goes. You never know what tomorrow brings, certainly not as a writer.
So you mentioned, so you're doing the play, and then you've got two children's projects.
I have, I'm just going to turn you up my end volume-wise. Hang on, I will loom. That might be better. Yeah, I have a couple of children's books that I'm working on at the moment. One of them is, believe it or not, a kind of spin-off from Doctor Who. It's a series called The Lucy Wilson Mysteries, and my publisher happens to publish all those, so he asked me, having published my book of poems, whether I'd like to write one. So I find myself in the Whovian world.
That sounds fascinating. Okay. So you've got that.
And there's one of my own as well. Sorry, the other one I'm writing, which we talked about on the phone, is what is called a young adult novel. And that the protagonists, the main characters in that, are in their early teens. So you're able, naturally, when you're not writing for children per se, you're able to use more mature, challenging themes. I mean, in my book, which is called The Sweat of the Sun, which is what the Incas, the ancient Incas in Peru, used to call gold, called it the sweat of the sun. And that book takes place 2,000 years apart, the two storylines are. We follow the storyline of a young Inca boy and a young boy living up in the Cotswolds. And I'm excited by that because it's a mixture, I suppose, of my love for words, which poetry really testifies, and my long drama experience. So you actually when you're writing it, even though it's a book, you're writing it very visually. You know, it's like writing a screenplay, a movie. Each chapter becomes a scene, you know, and you have to really see the pictures in your mind very, very clearly before you can advance it, you know?
Sure. And the piece of drama, who are you writing that for? What are you doing?
Well, all being well, the BBC in Wales, because the theme of the piece is a Welsh poet, another Welsh poet, not Dylan Thomas this time, but a wonderful writer called Alan, with a U, Alan Lewis, who was one probably of the two foremost poets of the Second World War. Lots of poets came out of the First World War. Wilfred Owen, obviously, and Siegfried Sassoon, and Robert Graves, and Edward Thomas, but not so many poets came out of World War II. And Alan Lewis, not only was he a fine poet, and he is a fine, or was a fine poet, but he had a very unusual life story, which I don't want to give too much away, but it involved two women, one of whom was his wife, and the other wasn't. But and that lasted all of 10 days in India, where he was posted, and it completely turned his life around, his head around. And tragically, shortly after all of that tsunami of emotion, he took his own life in Burma. So it's not a barrel of laughs, this play, but it's a serious piece and examines serious creativity. I mean, creativity is something which, I guess everybody in that room with you possesses, and it's both a gift and a privilege, and sometimes a responsibility. And I don't mean, I do this for a living, so I have to make it work. But I think even if you don't do it for a living, I think if you commit yourself to being an artist, a painter, a musician, you kind of got to go for it, really. And you've got to believe in yourself. You absolutely have to think, well, I have a voice. So developing a poetic voice, in inverted commas, is really important. You've got to have your own individual sound. No good if all you do is ape the work of other writers before you. And for me, and I say this whenever anyone will listen, the key to being a writer is being a reader. You'd be amazed on the infamous Facebook where so many people post poems, it seems totally evident that they've never opened a book of poems in their life. I mean, they just haven't. I have a little phrase for it. I call it projectile vomit. And an awful lot of their Sturm und Drang, all their passion and their, it's basically their goldfish has died and they want the world to know. And it really isn't good enough. I mean, you look at the great writers and the majority of them just historically were men, although you have wonderful women poets as well. You look at Milton, or you look at Wordsworth, or you look at Byron, you look at Keats, you look at Shelley. These guys slaved by candlelight to write thousands and thousands of words. They didn't expect they would just pick up their quill, dash off something, and the world would beat a path to their door. That ain't how it works. And it's interesting we're talking this evening because literally an hour ago, I had a phone call from a producer with whom until an hour ago, I was setting up a feature film. And an hour ago, he rang to say that the funding organization backed out. Not because the project was bad, but because it was in Wales. And I'm ashamed to say this as a proud Welshman, but the Welsh institutions are a joke in terms of funding. And we kind of expected they'd do this to us, and they have. But we got very excited, and it was actually based upon the producer's father's life. His father was Burmese, and he fought during the Second World War in the jungle of Burma with a group of people. You can probably hear my cat, hello cat, called the Chindits, who were a long-range deep penetration group fighting the Japanese in the jungle. And what's extraordinary is that this was an animated feature film we were going to do, 90 minutes animated. So that would have been a hell of a challenge. And an hour ago, it ceased to be. And that is the nature of the writing life. The writing life is basically trying to set up a million different projects if you're a freelance, so you can feed the blinking cat, and most of them, falling by the wayside. But, you have to pick yourself up, dust yourself off, say bugger it, and carry on with the next thing,
You touched on what you think is bad poetry. Well, you talked about bad poetry. What do you see, or what do you look for in a good poem? What do you think a good poem should contain?
Well, what do I look for in a good poem? Universality. That's a big word, isn't it? I like poems to touch across cultures, across ages, across time. Not just poems, but dramas as well, we, all of us, I mean, I'm forever saying, because I mentioned, I think to you the other day, that I've just been asked to become an editor, or technically it's called editor-in-chief, which sounds dead flash, of an online magazine. And it'll give me a chance to kind of bang on a bit more about my belief here. But one thing I tend to say to poets is you don't have to be in all of your poems. It really is not necessary for all of your poems to be kind of navel gazing. I mean, Wordsworth, one of the greatest English lyric poets, and Coleridge, his mate, in a work called The Lyrical Ballads, talked about poetry as emotion reflected in tranquility. So what they're saying there is, live your life, have all your amazing, colorful experiences, but don't tell us in that moment what it was like. Go away you know, have a glass of Vimto, and then maybe a little while later reflect on your emotions and then craft a piece of work. I mean, Dylan Thomas used the expression "in my craft or sullen art." And for him and for me, poetry is more than just an art, it's a craft. You've got to understand something about how you make a poem work. And by that, I don't mean all poems have to be the same or all poems have to rhyme. I'm just going to grab my cat a moment, because otherwise he's trying to dictate a poem to me. Cat?
That was the last I saw.
Yes, I heard that poem before. Now he's cunningly hidden himself now under the table. So you don't have to go to university to be a writer. You don't have to go to night school. You don't have to, but you have to read. You've got to, you know, you would never dream of being a musician if you had never heard music. You would never dream of being a painter if you'd never looked at paintings. But you'd be amazed how, because in the main, the majority of people in the so-called developed world can write. They can use words. But that isn't enough to make them writers, you know. That's like step one. You've got to go to step 99 and beyond, and you're always refining your work. I mean, Dylan, God bless him, who I feel, because I spent 50 years with his work, and you know, there's 40 poems in this book which reflect on him and his work and his life. He would spend a day over one word. And his wife, Kathleen, who was an extraordinarily interesting and powerful woman in her own right, used to lock him in his writing room until he'd written a quota for the day, and only then unlock the door so he could go to the pub. And he would, and here, there's where they live. Can you see that? Can you see that? The boathouse in Larne, in Carmarthenshire, which everyone associates with Dylan Thomas, although he only lived there for 3 years at the end of his life. For the first 21 years of his life, and in a minute I'm going to read you a poem, he lived in Swansea in his birth house. And I've got the honour in a couple of weeks' time to be giving a reading there and being interviewed there. And it's in a road called Cumdonkin Drive in Uplands in Swansea. And it's just down the road from this most wonderful park called Cumdonkin Park. And that was his playground as a child. And Thomas, who, if you don't know his work, I thoroughly recommend you Google him, find some of his work. So many of his adult poems are rooted in his childhood. And I was fortunate growing up in Cardiff, Swansea. I had very close to my house, it wasn't a park, it was a common. But that was where I spent my childhood, growing up, playing football, you know, falling over, all the rest of it. And much of my poetry, and this is one of the things that unite me with Dylan, not talent, but the ability to reflect upon my childhood and see how important that was as a mixing, as a crucible, a mixing bowl for themes and subjects that in later life became something, you know, different and magical and exciting. And childhood is, as long as we haven't had a miserable childhood, childhood remains a place of wonderment. And it's the sort of place that you can go back and you can mine it for nuggets of creativity. And many writers do that.
Interesting. Do you think that a good poem needs to be visual, like drama?
I think poems are visual because you're using imagery. I mean, you just call the imagery, similes and metaphors, but much of the time you are using pictures. You're talking about pictures. It's just like radio plays are very visual, ironically. You have to think when you're writing the script of a radio play, how you communicate with an audience at home who can't see you and can't see any of the places you're describing, how you can suddenly let their imagination become part of the equation. And that's why when we listen to radio plays, and I've written 5 or 6 of them now, commissioned plays for the BBC, everybody will see the characters that little bit differently because they will make them within their minds. When you see a movie or a television piece or even a stage play, you've got the character standing there. But with a radio play, you have all sorts of freedoms. I mean, I have a radio play set in orbit that was called The High Frontier. And it was a 90-minute play, so it's the length of a feature film. And it was set based on real life. The Russians, or the Soviets as they were in those days, had an orbiting space station called Mir. And when the Soviet Union fell apart, or, the Gorbachev time, there was a cosmonaut up there along with 3 or 4 others who they literally couldn't afford to bring down. I mean, they didn't have the money, basically. So they left him there for an extra year. He was not happy about this because he had a library book he had to return. And so the play is all about, what that did to his head, and radio, of course, gives you a lovely opportunity for the monologue, the character talking to himself, or thoughts being verbalized. Radio is, you've got to call it audio these days, of course, because people listen to it on things like this, on iPods and iPads, but audio drama, it's very popular still. You'll reach hundreds of thousands of people when it's broadcast, and it will stay being broadcast across the years because it will be put on to World Service and it will be repeated and everything else. And I also have a radio play about Glenn Miller, the band leader. But it's a play called Stardust. And what I'll try to do at some point is I'll try to send you a digital file of one of these plays, which you can share with the group if you'd like to. But that play is also about 10 young airmen, the crew of an American bomber flying Fortress. It's both the story of a public figure. Miller was a famous band leader before the war, and during the war he took his entire band and put them in uniform, and they came to Europe and they entertained all of the predominantly American troops and airmen in this country. And of course, some of you might know one autumn day he flew away to Paris and was never seen again. So it's one of the great mysteries, whatever happened to Glenn Miller. There's lots of theories, like aliens and everything else, but he never arrived, and he just left us with his music, but he himself was gone. Well, I couldn't have done that. I mean, I spent the research period for that was marvelous because I went to RAF Duxford, which is near Cambridge, where they have several flying fortresses. And they very kindly just put me in a hangar closed the door, and I just sat in the Flying Fortress for 7 hours on my own in the silence, just drinking in the pictures. You know what I'm saying here? And feeling how, when I described the choreography of the characters, when the plane was in combat, you know, I needed to picture how much room I had around me, and you didn't have much. 10 men on a fortress, and it wasn't very, you know, it was long and skinny, really. But research, you know, this leads on to research is vital. I mean, you've got to do your research for anything, particularly if it's a factually based thing. And I've written lots of historically based dramas. I'm an historian by academic training, but it's a great discipline for a writer, being an historian, because it gets you into the habit of researching things and finding the important bits, you know, and you starting off with the facts of the matter, and then developing in a creative way the fiction around the matter. So it's a give and take, but all the time, you know, you are thinking in pictures, sure, very much so.
What led you from the poetry to the drama?
Money. I was starving. No, I was actually, after I went to Cambridge. After university, I got a job giving money away to the arts, like for the Arts Council, that kind of thing. And I moved from Wales, where I grew up, to the southwest of England. I'm talking to you from my house, which overlooks the River Severn, overlooks the 2 bridges across to Wales. So every morning I wake up, I look out, and I see the land of my fathers, which, as Dylan Thomas once said, my fathers are welcome to it. And tonight I feel that way, having been turned down on the movie thing. Yeah, so I've lived in the West. I live in Gloucestershire, and I am fortunate. I live in a place, a very beautiful place, but the life of a writer is not particularly beautiful. David Mamet, who is a very fine film director and writer, described his career. He said, I sit in a room by myself, I talk to myself, and I write the conversation down. And that kind of is how writers work, you know. I mean, the idea that we are all kind of Byronic characters with silk shirts slit to the waist, you know, quaffing mead, and roister-doistering with ladies is a bit true, but not complete. Unfortunately, I'm still trying. Can I read you something?
Yes.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Right. Well, I'm going to read you the first poem I'm just going to close the door because the cat has gone elsewhere. So I'm just going to close the door a moment. You'd have loved Pippin. He's a ginger cat. He's a moggy, a farm cat, and he's great. He spends his life. I mean, the great thing about cats is that their reality is sleep, not wake. I mean, 15 hours a day is the average that a cat sleeps, you know, and if she's not sleeping, he's eating. Okay, here we go. What people know about Dylan Thomas very often is that they imagine him to be, you know, a drunkard. He drank a lot, you know, and a womanizer. He womanized a lot. But he was a phenomenal wordsmith. He probably, and I have this from his daughter, and indirectly from his wife, was a terrible father. and not a very good husband. When he died in New York in 1953, having had a kind of seizure, really, which was not, as many people think, a result of overdrinking, although he did overdrink, but was a medical complication. I think probably he was an undiagnosed diabetic. And he spent 4 days in a coma. And when Kathleen, his wife, flew out to be with him at the end, allegedly, when she walked into St. Vincent's Hospital, the first sentence she said is that bloody man dead yet? Which is a hard one, you know. But I will read you in a moment a poem that will show a different side of Kathleen and her feelings. But when he was young, when he was in his teens, when he was 14, he was an athlete as a schoolboy. He wasn't just this, bloated and dissolute figure. And he won in Swansea. He won the Swansea Mile, and was given a medal. And right the way through to beyond his death, he carried the cutting in his wallet of winning the Swansea Mile at the age of 14. And so the first poem in the book is called Memory of a Miler. 25 years carried, crumpled, precious in a succession of empty wallets. Dylan Thomas treasured the memory of that day in 1928, aged 14, that he won the Swansea Mile at St. Helens Sports Ground. Swansea grammar boy beaming with pride, not yet a poet, time enough for that. Images of Dylan range so widely from angelic upstart in an ugly, lovely town to bloated being, seeing his sad life disappear like the sun going down over Mumbles. But not very often do we recall a spindly teen, kitted out to run and beat all contenders. Coming first is unambiguous. The finishing tape tells no lies. The years that followed saw new entrances as poetic lines started to compete for attention. Young athletes' feet replaced by metric ones. A starting gun was fired, a new race begun, only to end overseas, a quarter of a century away, crossing the finishing flat line in a New York hospital. No accolades bestowed, no medal or trophy given, just an obituary echoing round a darkened stadium. But all the time his hard miles disappeared, Dylan carried proof, hidden like a tattered talisman, that once upon a time he was an athlete. And sometimes in smoky pubs on lost rainy nights, in uplands or posh Upper East Side Gotham City, in his cups or painfully sober, he'd unfold the newspaper cutting, creased with miles travelled, marked by the fingertips of his stubby poet's hands. Beaming with pride of his new rose-tinted reflection, Dylan would, at least in that instant, seem to dismiss all his other achievements and endeavours, poetry, prose, play for voices, failing to breast the tape, always second place on the heels of the miler, a highlight that never dimmed, a gold medal memory in a world that over ticking time raced by, turning gold to silver, then bronze, then black. We all need magic. We all carry in hands or soft heart furry rabbit's feet and four-leafed clovers, locks of our beloved lover's hair in lockets, to buoy us up when the world pushes us down. And so it was for him, adulation freely offered, sometimes just didn't matter quite as much, couldn't match one Swansea day when, lungs grasping for air, a skinny boy felt his very first kiss of victory. So that's the first poem in the book. And the book then goes through his life, really, and poems, and the theme of those poems reflect different aspects of the man, and areas where I have my own perspective and I share my take on his take, so it's a very personal book, as well as a kind of a biographical book about Dylan, But I didn't feel, having grown, my dad, who passed about 10 years ago, was a comedian and entertainer called Stennnett. And all of his life, he used words and created pictures and made pantomime and made entertainments. So I grew up in a very unusual world. I grew up in dressing rooms. In those days, variety theatre was very closely related to circus. On the bill, very often there were animal acts. There were performing seals and bears. There were, half-naked chorus girls. I was always very fond of that. And there were singers, dancers, jugglers, the sand dance, a bit of everything. And of course, always the comedian, normally always the top of the bill. People like my dear dad, who, after a very, very difficult childhood, being orphaned, at the age of 25, was on the stage of the London Palladium. I mean, whoa, that's a bit of a jump. And then all of the people that were his contemporaries and friends, of course, were just people I knew. Dear Eric Morecambe, who sadly passed away after working with my dad in a charity show back in 1984. Ernie Wise, of course, and Tommy Trinder. I mean, all the people that those of you of a certain age will remember from that wonderful world. But they were just the big people around when I was a little kid, backstage in theatres. There was no way I was going to become a bank manager with a childhood like that. And I didn't go to school till I was 7. The authorities caught me like the dog catcher and said, he must be educated. But I was being educated in those dressing rooms full of half-naked chorus girls. That was part of my curriculum, you see, curriculum vitae, and yes, vitae, good work. And then, 3 years at university, reading history, which was marvelously helpful to my subsequent career as a writer. In 1984, I left my job giving away money. I thought it was a good Orwellian year, 1984, to become a freelance writer. And from that moment on, I've never known where the next farthing was coming from. But when you become a freelance writer, you learn very quickly that you have to be flexible and adaptable. And there was no way I could support my partner and my son. And a poet doesn't get paid anything much. So I had to find something. I mean, I wanted to write drama, but drama suddenly came along. I'm the only person in the world who's written for both Sooty and the Royal Shakespeare Company. And I put that in everything because it seems important, and most things in between. And radio and television and documentary, And animation, of course, came along in my life as well. And suddenly, you do the maths on that. Back in the day, a full-length stage play, which might take you months of research, long time to write and rewrite, and you'd probably be, if you were lucky, you'd probably earn about £4,000 for maybe the best part of a year's work. For a 25-minute animation script that I could write in a day, I'd earn 3. So you can see how the mixed economy of a freelance writer is important. You know, if you're lucky enough to get work on a animated cartoon series, and you're asked to write 3 or 4 episodes, you know, apart from the fun and games and the collaborative work with other creatives, you know, I worked with Dudley Moore playing a piano. I mean, literally playing the character of a piano. You know, you get to meet some nice people. You get to do nice things. I went to Los Angeles and spent time in a wonderful studio called Hanna-Barbera, which is one of the great animation houses on the planet, really. And I met Mr. Hanna and Mr. Barbera, and, you know, they created characters who enthralled me when I was a child. So I grew up on cartoons. So cartoons were really important in my life. And there was a time when I was definitely one of the busiest writers of animation in the UK. And I worked, you know, for loads of people, including Disney, and, you know, I loved it. And I would still write animation now. And the movie that's just gone south would have been animation. It wouldn't have been for kids, but nevertheless, it would have used the techniques and technology of animation, which has changed hugely. Computers have made everything different now. Once upon a time, everything was drawn by hand, whereas now, of course, the box in the corner does it, really, with the expert help of the operator. But back in the day, people had to use, you know, literally use pen and paper to make cartoons work. Now, tell me, did you share that little extra thing I sent you?
I didn't get a chance to share. Do you mean the poem? So
I didn't want you to share it because I wanted to just read it.
Yeah.
So can I do that now?
Please, that would be wonderful. So Roger's written a poem, especially
for you guys, for tonight. And look, it's there. It's printed on a picture. And this is going to be the extra special prize for the competition that I'm judging later in the year. I will let you have this, and you can do what you like with it, really. I'll read the poem to you now, and you can make of it what you wish, but it's written with affection. It's called Horlick's Heaven, and it starts with the famous 2 lines from John Betjeman. Come friendly bombs and fall on Slough. It isn't fit for humans now. Betjeman was not a fan of Slough, beseeching bombs to fall and rain down to cauterize the town from the surrounding king's realm, as it contended with the Luftwaffe's might. Curmudgeonly John pretended he didn't give a flying fig about the place you all call home. Mistaken, I'm sure. No doubt if he'd taken his time to inhale the local air and drink warm beer in local pubs, and more to his taste the cake of faux rustic tea shops dotted along the handsome high street, then this champion of ancient ways and guardian of antique anachronisms would have seen that Slough's glass is half full and not mostly empty, And then perished the thought that he would not have besought ordnance to cascade down upon your brave Berkshire forebears. And all this from an avid aesthete who went up to sepia-tinted Oxford accompanied by his large teddy bear, not called Aloysius, like the ursine chum of Lord Marchmain's younger son. Evelyn Waugh modelled it on dear John B., who preceded the fictional Sebastian Flight in Brideshead Revisited by several years. But I digress, and I guess you've realised my theme was Armageddon, coming in Dorniers and Heinkels. And if they had heeded Betjeman's call, carnage would have come. And what was its crime? What terrible sin had Slough committed? Simply not to be more like Cheltenham, pure and simple, a pimple upon the face of the landscape, not a Regency beauty spot or kiss curl of a place, but disgraceful enough in the eyes of a puffed up, portly snob. So John climbed upon his high horse and galloped into the searchlight sunset to find a far lovelier place than Slough. I wonder if he ever found his haughty Shangri-La, or whether, after all these years, he's still chasing Cotswold rainbows that never ever seem to shine over dear old sleepy Slough Spa, dreaming its way to Horlick's heaven. There you go. That's your poem, guys. And I wrote it this morning, actually. I thought, well, I can't come empty-handed, so you'll get it. So there we are.
Very impressive. Thank you.
Okay. Now let's have a little tiny pause and ask if there's anybody else that would like to ask me some questions.
We've got a few minutes left before the Zoom thing. So any questions? I'll say, okay, nice and loud. Yeah.
Yeah, there's one thing I've been thinking about poetry, which I've tried to write a fair bit over time, is like the rhyme scheme.
Yeah.
You can have a poem, with a structural rhyme scheme, a villanelle or a sonnet or something of that sort.
Yeah, of course.
What's your feeling about writing a poem which has rhyme here and there, but doesn't follow a scheme? So it might be a prose poem with the odd rhyme because it just happens to fit in that line. Or do you think it should either rhyme with a proper scheme or just be not rhyming at all, just a free rhyme poem?
No, that is such a good question. However, having heard now two of my poems, you know the answer. I mean, my poems rhyme internally, and I love internal rhymes. I love assonance. I love sound within the poem. I hardly ever use what is called end rhyme. What Alexander Pope, the great 18th century writer, called the rocking horse of rhyme, because it becomes too da-dum-de-dum-de-dum, and that for me kills emotion dead. I mean, a poem is meant to convey something. I mean, it doesn't always have to be a grand message. I mean, some of the most wonderful poems are nature poems. This is a good example of me going back to what I said at the start about you don't have to be in every poem. Do a Wordsworth, put a daffodil in the middle of it, or a river or a mountain or something. But I think if you constrain your emotion and your intellect and your vision and your passion and force it into shoes that are not quite the right size for your feet, your poetic feet, then you do yourself a disservice and you don't really satisfy anybody. I have nothing against villanelle. I have nothing against sonnet. Shakespearean, Petrarchan, whatever. I have nothing against other wonderful form like haiku. We can play with these and we can use them to huge effect. And many poems which you don't imagine, sonnets, for example, are. A lot of Wilfred Owen's war poetry were 49 sonnets, you know, although we're so caught up in the carnage of his vision and the pictures that we forget that these are quite structured pieces. But every poet has the right to write what they choose. And nobody can get up and tell you you've done it wrong, because there is no wrong. The only wrong for me is dishonesty, is creative dishonesty. And I think you must let your heart flow through the words, and you should vary it. And sometimes rhyme, sometimes don't rhyme, and both are equally valid. Does that help?
Yes, it does. It sort of justifies what I tend to do. Like I've always wondered.
Well, God bless you, sir. I mean, you know, there are phrases you would have come across like blank verse and free verse, and you know, perhaps an older generation, older even than I'm in my early 70s, would have said, "Oh no, this isn't a poem. This is prose." Well, it's not prose. If I say it's a poem, it's a poem.
Yeah, it's just
you know, and on my passport it says writer, so I know.
No, I was just going to say, sometimes a rhyme just jumps into my head. I'm not trying to rhyme, but it sort of shouts at me. And that's
Rhymes will do that.
Yeah.
Rhymes will do that. But please allow yourself to find the subtle rhyme. Because if you don't find the subtle rhyme, you'll end up with a gross rhyme. And it then becomes like a rather naff Christmas card, or, you know, not good. But words, you know, it's a serious job being a writer, and it's a craft, as I said earlier on, as well as an art. And with most crafts, you know, you tend to polish a bit, and you have to know when to stop. You know, I mean, you have to know. You say, okay, it'll never be finished. As I say, only God is perfect. And perhaps not even God is perfect some days. So I think you just allow yourself the freedom to be an artist.
Luke, I'm fascinated to hear you didn't go to school until the age of 7.
Yeah, totally illegal.
The most creative person I ever worked with claimed not to have gone to school till the age of 9 because he and got lost. Do you think that you're more creative because you didn't get straitjacketed as early as the rest of us? I sometimes think that I can't think differently because I've been trained not to.
Oh, good question. I was feral, you know, until I was 7 in a way. I mean, I kind of wasn't wearing metaphorical shoes. I mean, I was romping, and I was with adults and chimpanzees. You know, I was in it was the truth. I mean, he was called Gilbert, the chimpanzee. So for me, my reality was bigger than the reality of my peers. And it was so odd when I went to school, you know, and walked in that first day. Wordsworth, again, I quote Wordsworth, you know, he had a phrase, shades of the prison house, he said, something like begin to fall upon the growing boy. You know, we are born with this great naturalness and this great trailing clouds of glory are we come from heaven, which is our home, said he. And then the world basically degrades us, you know. That's what it does if we're not careful. And we're put into the system. And okay, you can say, well, you didn't do too bad with the system. I mean, I passed my 11 plus, I got a scholarship to Cambridge. So, I mean, I must have done something right, but I didn't start off from the place most people started. And I'm happy. I'm happy. I wouldn't change it for the world. And my son is a musician. My dear father was a brilliant jazz musician. My son Sam has a band called the Schmoozenbergs, who play what's called gypsy swing. And they're just off to Wexford and Southern Ireland to do some gigs now. And his childhood wasn't my childhood identically, but it came with the same ethos, which is the importance of creativity. And you know, and he's passing that on to his daughters, and they will be, I'm sure, you know, wonderfully free-minded and hard work, as they should be. So yeah, I think it did help. Did you? But certainly, unless you're Doctor Who, you ain't going to go back and change it.
Was there anyone else?
Now, am I judging a competition for you? I am, aren't I, at some point?
Yes.
Yeah. And you've got, and I do believe, I'm told, you've got a theme, have you? Which is to do with monarchy.
I would think so Richard actually studied with King Charles.
Wow.
He was at Cambridge with him.
I was at Cambridge with King, yeah, oh yeah. I had a letter from him the other day. This is rather lovely. I sent him the book because he loves Dylan Thomas. And back in 69, 70, we were both reading history. And he was living next door to a school friend of mine. So I used to go and see my school friend, and, you know, I would see him when I could find my way up the staircase past the bottles. And we sat together often in lectures, and it's bloody awful handwriting, like a spider on acid. You know, I really think heaven only knows. But he was pleasant enough, and I think he's like most human beings. He's a curate's egg, isn't he? You know, good in parts. Unless you're a rabid Republican, which I'm not, but I'm certainly also not a monarchist. Yeah, so it was quite amusing to. He sent me back a very nice note and a lovely picture of he and his mother, actually. But it was a real Victorian mourning card. It was, you know, it had a black border around it, which is very old-fashioned, but understandable because it was still very raw for him, I'm sure. Then, yeah, I've written some poems about him over the years as well. But at least he had the courtesy to reply, which is more than blinking Michael Sheen did. Or Kerris Matthews. Oh, goodness me. I don't know. If someone sends you a present, you say thank you. Are you sure? There we are. But no, it was good. It was good. It's like my dad used to tell a joke about you know, getting his call-up papers, and about, you know, getting an envelope one day through the post that didn't have a stamp on it, and he said, "Who do I know who owns the post office?" And it was like that when I got the letter from the King, because of course it didn't have a stamp on. I've enjoyed myself tonight. I mean, we've only scratched the tip of the iceberg. But you know, we're united in a mutual endeavor, which we all of us obviously love. And I wish you well with your writing. I really, really do. Good luck, and I look forward to judging your competition. And maybe you could at some point let me have a copy of the tape or the film or the digi file or something, because I could pass it on to my publisher and they could put it all on our own.
We will organise that. Yeah.
All right.
People to do that. Thank you so much. It's been
all right.